Thank you. So, it has been 30 years since the fall of apartheid. Now, when you think of apartheid, what do you think about? What comes to mind? I would assume racism, segregation perhaps, bad housing, bad working conditions, bad living conditions. But I want to start by saying, whatever you think about apartheid, I promise you it was much, much worse. I actually think that the way most people think about apartheid in Britain and perhaps other places is just as a kind of another version of segregation in America, which obviously was also terrible. But I think there's a real lack of knowledge perhaps and understanding of what apartheid really meant and what it really looked like. I would say in Britain specifically, the British education system, you'll be shocked to find out, doesn't educate us at all in the role that it has played historically, especially in a place such as South Africa. And so hopefully through the course of this discussion we can begin to correct that, we can't cover absolutely everything that happened across the decades in South Africa and even go into everything that is happening in South Africa today. So this is really just an introduction to that, and we should have more conversations and more discussions in the organisation as time goes on. So, like most African countries, to form an analysis of South Africa today, we must first look at how it was even formed as a country in terms of the borders that it has. How did it come into existence? And actually the area that we recognise as South Africa was occupied by a range of different powers, different colonial powers, mainly Britain and the Dutch, who battled it out over a series of different wars and conflicts. And the British were a key colonial power doing what they do best, which is conquering land and trying to conquer people using divide and rule, using the indigenous people there, their interests against one another, to try and maintain control and also crucially extract as much wealth as possible. So conflicts and even wars between the British and the Dutch were a kind of constant feature throughout the 19th century. But the British, obviously, they wanted sole control of South Africa. South Africa was seen as this prize, the utmost colonial prize, a colonial possession. And that is partly because of the discovery of diamonds and gold. This was like a red flag to a bull for the British imperialists. And the discovery of diamonds and gold in particular led directly to an influx of white immigration and capital into South Africa. Their goal was very simple: exploit the land and the labour in the most efficient way possible. How can we get the most out of what we have discovered? And so South Africa, like so many other African countries, was dragged into capitalism by colonialism, dripping blood from every pore. And mining was an especially key part of industry, an especially key part of the foundations upon which it was built. Now, capitalism is not a moral system. It's a mode of production. What drives it forward is commodity production, right? And in South Africa, there was seemingly endless potential. It was such a mineral-rich country. So they had to bring in people initially who could make the most of this with a certain amount of knowledge, a certain amount of so-called skilled labour was necessary to import into it. But what they also needed was a steady supply, a constant steady supply of cheap, so-called unskilled labour to actually do the work. And it was the combination of those two things. And that supply of labour, that was to be sourced from the dismantled kind of African peasantry, with a range of measures implemented to ensure that they could continue that process, continue getting these people into the mines, for example, to do the work. So, for example, within 3 years of the opening of the Witwatersrand goldfields in 1886, it started off with about 17,000 African workers employed in the mines, together with about 11,000 whites who were employed. 20 years later, the figures reached 200,000 black workers and 23,000 whites. So that's a kind of small example of how they were operating, and it's kind of from that the whole of the South African economy mushroomed and grew. Will you time me every 10 minutes? And so Britain went about trying to make this as efficient as possible. That also involved making sure that South Africa kind of was unionized. It was separated into different areas. There was kind of different areas within South Africa. And so the Union of South Africa formally came into being in 1910, which excluded, you'll be shocked to find out, the indigenous Africans living there from all aspects of political life. And we should say that process actually created probably one of the largest, wealthiest, most concentrated white settler populations in the whole of Africa on one end of the pole. But also at the other end of the pole, there was an enormous nascent, what was to become enormous black working class at the same time. And there's quite a big contradiction there, which they later found out about. So the point is the foundations for the introduction of capitalism to South Africa help us to understand how it went on to produce one of the most vicious segregationist regimes that exist. And I wanted to start with those foundations because we should say that what happened in South Africa in terms of apartheid wasn't just capitalism gone wrong, which is obviously how the liberals would like to think about it. Like, that was a really nasty example of what happened, but don't worry, we sorted it out later. This wasn't an aberration of capitalism. It was still capitalism, yes, but I think we can say it was a capitalism that developed in a very specific way and a very brutal way because of the nature of colonialism and imperialism at that time and the minerals and the resources that they were able to extract. It was, and it remains to be, a terrible thing to be born in a land with so much gold and diamonds and resources, especially in the early years of capitalism. And so there was this large population that existed there that would go on to become the working class that would eventually, in a formal sense, abolish the apartheid system. The ruling class needed to find a way to subjugate this layer. But slavery, in terms of like the transatlantic slave trade, it wasn't really an option by this time. Slavery wasn't really after it had been kind of formally abolished in the US Civil War and so on and so forth, slavery wasn't a direct option. So they ended up with this other kind of version. They had to find a way to subjugate them and keep them there and keep them working. And this is where the idea of the migrant labor system comes in, which is also a key component of the South African economy. And I really want to start, and I've really emphasized this point about how they needed to use the local population, precisely because there are so many comparisons drawn with Palestine, understandably. People look back at the struggle against apartheid and they compare Israel and South Africa in a somewhat, it's an understandable comparison that people are trying to make. But when you get into the details of how the economies worked, it's very different. And the key difference is this. In South Africa, they needed the population there in order to force them into work. But in Israel, the ruling class does not want the Palestinians. They want them gone, in fact. And that is an important difference as to how these oppressions manifest themselves and what they look like and why what's happening in Gaza is so extreme right now. They want them gone completely, which is very different from actually what they were trying to build in South Africa. Now, there was this migrant labor system, and what was apartheid and how did it even come into being? The roots of apartheid are obviously in the colonial conquest of South Africa itself. And we can look at certain laws, which are just kind of highlights of expressing what was taking place. Because you had these, colonial governments, and then later the South African state itself, and the British kind of formally eventually, let South Africa go. They implemented laws to ensure this constant availability of black labour for mines and industries, whilst also at the same time trying to restrict land ownership. That was a big part of what they were doing. I should also say, in terms of what they did in restricting land, controlling where people lived, there was also a political kind of social side to this, which is to just keep people segregated and away and depressed in a certain sense. But yeah, there was a Native Land Act in 1913, which essentially restricted black people from buying or occupying any land apart from as employees of a white master. And that is what opened the door for essentially white ownership of 87% of the land. And this was a big part of the base of the migrant labour system. You had contract labour migrant workers who were recruited through labour bureaus or contracts, and they would work for fixed periods of times in mines, factories or farms before trying to return to rural areas. And workers who lived in hostels or compounds, these were tightly controlled, overcrowded, often very far from their families. And on top of this, you had something called pass laws. This was a big part of life in South Africa, where black workers were required to carry like pass books, which would restrict their movements. It said where they were able to go and how far and in what kind of way. And failure to produce a pass book could result in arrest or imprisonment. And this happened all the time. I think if you look at the actual statistics in terms of in the whole of time of apartheid, like millions and millions, it's like millions of arrests specifically on this question of pass books. And actually the pass book aspect became a big part of the fight against apartheid later on, which I'll go on to explain. So all of this facilitated the continued coercion of them into mines, forcing them to remain segregated and live in the worst conditions possible. As I say, they wanted them to work in the mines and also sometimes in the cities, but they still wanted that segregation, so then they would house them completely somewhere else as well. And so it's on this basis that you had the growth of capitalism in South Africa, this super exploitation of workers on mines and farms. Although we should say, even though mining played a massive role at the start, from 1933 onwards, the manufacturing industry is what began to expand very rapidly, and it actually overtook mining as the biggest single contributor to national production during the Second World War. And that's really important because the growth of the manufacturing industry completely swelled the size of the working class in areas that were much harder for the bosses to control than as they were able to in farms, for example, or mining. So between 1932 and 1944, the number of African workers in manufacturing more than tripled, and it just began to kind of grow. And off the back of that, struggle began to take place. Class struggle is the way we should understand it. So it's actually kind of interesting that in terms of official apartheid, that is in the government that properly introduced it, the Afrikaner nationalists that came to power in 1948, they came to power right at the time that actually the working class was just beginning to grow and kind of enter decisively, if you want, onto the stage of history, well, the stage of South African history anyway. But it's precisely at this time in 1948 that the Afrikaners come to power. And they officially bring in apartheid as the official kind of state law, if you want. And apartheid literally means apartness, it means separateness. That is what they were basing themselves on. But in reality, all they did was strengthen the existing migrant labour system and structures that already existed. So they institutionalized racial segregation through lots of different laws. The Group Areas Act, which is ensuring that the black workers would live in designated areas. They would designate like certain homelands for certain peoples, and that was where they were supposed to live. The state also, crucially, put everyone into racial categories. And there were 4 main racial categories: white, black, coloured, and Indians. 80% were black, 8% coloured, 8% white, and like about 2.5% Indian. And this obviously has a massive political and social aspect as well. And I think there's a lot of really interesting things that this shows us that we don't really have time to discuss fully today about what race even is. Because there's a lot of contradictions in how they classified people and who became white or was considered white or not white, which has a massive lesson for us in terms of how we think about race today, which often is presented as a very fixed thing, but it's not entirely fixed. It's actually entirely related to capitalism today, and that's why South Africa has quite a peculiar understanding. The terms that people use in South Africa are not the terms that we might use in Britain or might be used in America, and sometimes I think people in Britain and America are shocked by this, but it's a good awakening that race is not just how it exists in the West. But that's by the by. One of the first apartheid laws that they introduced was the Prohibition of the Mixed Marriages Act, followed closely by the Immorality Amendment Act, which made it illegal for South African citizens to try and marry or pursue sexual relationships across racial lines. This is a very, very deeply divided and segregationist society. that's entirely rooted in the role that British imperialism and the Dutch played at the start. So the introduction of apartheid was then met immediately with a decade of mass resistance in the 50s. And this is entirely connected to the fact that the working class had then grown quite a lot, in which eventually you had the African National Congress, the ANC, come to the fore, which obviously we know as the main party that came to power after apartheid was defeated with Nelson Mandela. So we have to deal with the ANC, but we should also say that it wasn't always the case that the ANC were the main political force fighting for liberation. What I mean by that is, in any liberation struggle, there are going to be different political forces and organizations that play different roles. Often after the so-called liberation has been completed, people look back and paint a story as though it was one linear process and these people or this force had it right the entire time and they just kind of rose to the top. But that's not at all how struggle, class struggle, especially not kind of nationalist struggles, that's not how they work in any way, shape or form. History is not a straight line. Liberation is not a straight line. And the class struggle, above all, is not a straight line, but you can pattern out in that sort of way. We have to look at what were the competing political ideas and forces that produced the struggle in the first place. The ANC was founded in 1912, so actually it was quite an old organisation, even from the time of the 50s. But when it was founded, it was an organisation that was largely based on the middle class and the chiefs and lawyers and priests and layers like this. And at the beginning, it did not have a mass following. It wasn't until after the formal introduction of apartheid, this kind of decade of mass resistance began, that it started to become more radical and more relevant. And how did that happen? It was led by its youth wing, who pushed for more radical ideas, of which Nelson Mandela was a key aspect. He was a part of the youth wing and pushed and eventually obviously got into the leadership. They wanted to call for actions like pass burnings about the pass books and stayaways. And this is what helped push them further into a leadership role in the struggle as a whole. A stayaway was a form of strike action, literally stay away. So the ANC was there, but you also had the Communist Party. The South African Communist Party played a big role, actually, in the struggle against apartheid, but in a almost slightly distorted sense. And what I mean by that is that the ANC effectively was supported by the South African Communist Party. The Communist Party was founded in 1921, like so many other communist parties, after the Russian Revolution, the founding of the Comintern and so on. But for reasons and times we can't go into, the Communist Party was banned in 1950. So they essentially decided to just dissolve themselves into the ANC. But to be honest, whether they had been formally banned or not is not the central question. The central question was the political ideas in the Communist Party that defined their outlook and their approach to the ANC. Because by 1950, the South African Communist Party was fully under the influence of Stalinism, essentially, which had a massive impact on communist parties all over the world. An analysis of the Communist Party, its relationship with the ANC, all of this is worth a whole discussion, but what the main thing you need to understand is how kind of merged and linked they became. You had members of the Communist Party that got to leading positions in the ANC itself. And there are important consequences to this, the main thing being this: the theoretical base of the Communist Party and the ANC became the two-stage theory. Which is first the democratic struggle, then the socialist one, if you were to sum it up in 2 words. And that political idea massively beheaded the working class in South Africa and the labour movement of the role that it could have played in destroying not just apartheid, but capitalism itself, upon which apartheid was based. What was the two-stage theory? The theory argued that the main tasks of the revolution in South Africa were national democratic. What does that mean? That it's the national liberation of the majority of the population, the oppressed black masses, was the first and fundamental task of that revolution. And as a consequence of this, the Communist Party leaders said the movement needed to try to form the broadest possible alliance of Democrats in order to defend that goal and defend that purpose. And in order to do that, to reach those people, socialist demands needed to be left to one side in order not to frighten other layers that would join the struggle. AKA, let's not frighten the white liberals or perhaps some, the very few middle class and black or coloured people. Only after the national democratic stage of the revolution had been fulfilled could the question of socialism be posed. And so that idea, that political idea, meant that the leadership of the liberation struggle had to be left to the middle-class ANC leaders rather than the Communist Party, and the Communist Party would have to take a back seat. Now, as I said, this idea, this theory wasn't an invention didn't just come from the South African Communist Party themselves, but the two-stage theory was a key part of the ideas of Stalinism that kind of infected the whole of the communist movement. Even though it has nothing to do with genuine Leninism and has nothing to do with actually the genuine lessons of the Russian Revolution itself, Lenin's position on this was entirely clear in the case of Russia, that the main tasks of the revolution in Tsarist Russia were bourgeois democratic. But the fact was that the Russian bourgeoisie had come onto the scene far too late to play this kind of role. And actually the bourgeois in Russia were terrified of the revolutionary role that the working class could continue to play. They were terrified of the working class questioning the rule of capital itself, and so on every single occasion they would compromise with the interests of foreign imperialist powers and the old Tsarist regime to betray the revolution. That lesson was actually learned. So as Lenin explained, the task of the bourgeois democratic revolution could only be carried through under the leadership of the working class as part of the struggle for workers' power. And especially in the case of South Africa, we should say by 1950, South Africa was already a mainly urbanized, industrialized society in which the working class played a key role. So that should have been even clearer in the case of South Africa, though unfortunately it was not. Instead, the Communist Party leaders left the leadership of the struggle in theory and in practice to the middle class leaders of the ANC. Burgeoning revolutionary mood in the working class itself. As I say, the black working class had developed massively in the 30s and the 40s. And even in 1946, there was a massive strike that took place. This is before apartheid was formally introduced in 1948. And that was a strike that was brutally clamped down upon by the state. The entire Communist Party Central Committee was arrested. 12 people were killed. The union itself that organized it then completely collapsed. So from the very early days, the state was always terrified of the black working class and what they could do, and the militancy that they had. Class struggle became the major factor in it. I want to try and give you a flavour, but we could honestly be here for hours if we listed all of the strikes and all of the movements and all of the protests that took place. It's honestly incredible. It was constant, and it happened even before the 50s. As I say, between 1939 and 45, there were 304 strikes, mainly of African workers, and these industrial unions were beginning to form. But then the 50s comes in, you've got this hardline racist government, but the black workers immediately start fighting back in the factories, the mines, the townships, the farms, the reserves. On May Day in 1950, 80% of the workforce in one place went on strike, demanding higher wages, the vote, a halt to repression. On that day, the police shot and killed at least 20 people. And in protest of the shootings, a further strike was called later on that month, which then took place. The point is, this was the beginning of a decade of organisation and struggle, mass demonstrations, boycotts, defiance, uprisings against the pass laws, but not just that, against price and fare rises, against things in education, police repression, and all the burdens that apartheid produced on people's lives. I promise you, in one way or another, it was struggled against and protested against in some form. And that class struggle then had a massive impact on the ANC. They didn't just exist in isolation to it. They could see what was happening, and they felt it. They felt the pressure of the class struggle itself. Class struggle will push organisations, individuals and parties in certain directions. And as I say, you'd had this change now in the ANC of a more radical, youthful leadership that wanted more militant action. including Nelson Mandela. So the ANC changes and begins to kind of orientate itself a bit more to this struggle itself, and they updated their program. Which emphasized, national freedom and self-determination, and the end of institutional discrimination. It does raise initially only, mainly democratic demands, but it sets out these kind of more radical tactics as a way in which to achieve these. They adopt a Freedom Charter in 1955, which you probably know. It famously begins that we, the people of South Africa, declare for all of our country and the world to know, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. Now, the Freedom Charter is a very famous symbol of the struggle against apartheid, but within it, you can actually see contradictory ideas. And I would say the ideas that ultimately laid the path for class collaboration. At the same time, there are some more radical elements that are able to push through. For example, it also says, the national wealth of our country, the heritage of all South Africans, shall be restored to the people. The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks, and monopoly industry shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole, which is a bit more radical. It's a bit more our type. Look, we should say this is explicitly not socialism, but it's a kind of a mixing of more advanced democratic and social demands, which is important and plays a certain role. So the point about the ANC is it had this mixture of tactics, ideas, and approaches because it had a sort of contradictory leadership. But isn't that the story of all liberation struggles and all, I would say, like nationalist struggles as well? We see this all over the place and all over the time. And we should say it is not enough to be against your oppression or against the system that you are fighting. You must understand consciously what are you for and what are you trying to build. And if you don't know that, then it's going to impact what you do and how you try to get there. The ANC, for example, even supported some white liberal opposition parties in the 1958 all-white elections because they were constantly fearful, some of them, of alienating the white middle class, and so they always had this idea within them. The ANC didn't have a lot of support in the rural areas, which is actually where some of the most militant actions would take place, and because this was a weakness. People in the rural areas were much more willing to use violence against the apartheid state as well. So there were other organisations that filled a bit of this vacuum, filled a bit of this void, and connected with that mood better. You had the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, that was set up, and they were specifically set up because they wanted to move away from white involvement in the ANC, but also, to a certain degree, communists and the communist involvement, and they argued for direct confrontation with the apartheid state. They adopted the slogan of Nkrumah, Africa for the Africans, so they were a big kind of nationalist organisation. So you did have a period of time where you have the ANC and the PAC both waging struggles at the same time, specifically against the pass laws. That became a real central feature. One of the most famous examples of this happened in Sharpeville, the Sharpeville township. The PAC organised a protest against pass laws there, and something like 20,000 people came out to protest. And the police responded brutally. I think hundreds of people were killed, thousands were arrested. Now, the Sharpeville massacre massively radicalised the movement as well and set things forward. And so the ANC immediately called for a day of mourning, but also strikes, stayaways. It kind of lit things on fire. And in response to that, that's when the state decided to ban both the ANC and also the PAC. They were outlawed after this. Actually, a state of emergency was declared. But many workers and people in rural areas, completely independent of the ANC, whatever, they wanted to do something, they wanted to fight. So they would just continue mass strikes, indefinite stayaways. Very often, spontaneous uprisings of this kind happen, and actually the ANC wasn't always able to lead them or play a massive role. It was in Sharpeville, by the way, that many years later Mandela chose to sign the new constitution in 1996 because Sharpeville played such a massive role in radicalising the movement. It has a massive impact. But the point is the state ramps up its repression after this time. Both organisations are banned, and that repression means they had to go underground completely. So the ANC is exiled, and actually they were headquartered in Lusaka in Zambia. And it's at this time that the ANC begins to move its focus to more kind of guerrilla warfare, campaigns of sabotage, looking at the idea of the armed struggle against the apartheid state. And they founded a military wing. There was a military wing set up of the ANC, which was founded in partnership with the Communist Party and Mandela. And that is really why Mandela is arrested and forced to prison. And Mandela goes to prison in 1962. Now, we should say I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the armed struggle because it didn't play a massive defining role, really. And because they were outside, it was very hard for them to implement things. Of course, certain actions took place and they did certain things, but it didn't take on a mass character. And it was actually limited to outside of South Africa until the 80s anyway. It's true that the USSR did support the ANC a bit. They sent some military aid, but we should understand that the USSR obviously had its own interests and its own ideas at this time as well. It wasn't just kind of benevolent support. They saw the benefit of supporting these kind of liberation struggles as defined by the Cold War, which was taking place at the time, which also impacted how Margaret Thatcher and Reagan, how they approached South Africa later on in the 80s. But the point is, we should see this period as it wasn't a great period for the ANC, right? They're exiled, they've not got a mass base of support inside anymore, and they had to look to foreign governments and international organizations for sustenance. They were completely cut off from the black masses, so they kind of forced into this sterile diplomacy. And so it's a kind of low ebb for the ANC. And I think you could say that the banning of those organisations does then have an impact also within South Africa in the kind of later 60s. There's less kind of activity that takes place in terms of massive events that radicalised or pushed the movement forward. But also at that time in South Africa, the ruling class recognised they needed a bigger internal market and a better educated workforce. So they start to introduce more access to education for black children. And I mention this because you do then see a resurgence in the movement come not just from the working class, but the youth and students in particular. One of the turning points, really significant turning points in reigniting the struggle, was the Soweto uprising in June in 1976. This was probably one of the most famous events that drew international attention to what was happening in South Africa, where you had school students at the forefront of a massive uprising. These students began to protest in the streets in response to the introduction of Afrikaans as a language in school in which they would be taught. And Afrikaans was obviously considered the language of the oppressor, and it caused immense revulsion when they tried to implement it. Tens of thousands of students took part. Like, when we talk about these protests, we're not talking about a couple of us on the street with a placard. I'm talking massive, massive struggle. And unsurprisingly, the state responded in a brutal manner. Hundreds of school students were killed in response to this. And this got lots of international attention and really radicalized things entirely. You have to understand there's many different languages spoken in South Africa, but typically the students would have been taught in their native language. So this was kind of a step too far, and it really changed and transformed and reignited things. So as I say, this had enormous international significance. It was also to a certain degree tied up in the Black consciousness movement, which was a movement that came from the universities, ideas around Black pride, Black culture, around the ways in which racism, oppression, apartheid affects your mind and how you think about this. It was slightly impacted by that. But also the recent independence of Angola, Mozambique, all of this was happening at the same time to really churn things up. And I would say that the strength of the Soweto uprisings probably took the ANC by surprise, actually. They didn't see it coming. But above all, the ruling class. I think this is when the ruling class starts to panic and starts to see the direction in which things are going, or even could go, which is quite important. After the Soweto uprisings, I would say it started to become clear to the capitalists that the aims of the black masses were starting to go further than just anger against discriminatory policies and discriminatory apartheid laws. Led by now this emerging working class with the youth, they were beginning to challenge the whole system itself. And actually, later on then, this is late 70s and the early 80s, the regime they start to introduce some reforms. They introduce some economic reforms trying to diffuse the movement. And they actually try and introduce a whole new constitution to change things up, which set out its plans for political reforms. This is in 1983. This brave new constitution that they introduced included separate chambers for coloureds, Indians and whites. But there's a group there that you'll notice wasn't included. And a new executive state which would have extensive powers and so on. So the constitution was still entirely based on the apartheid system, with white guaranteed majorities and all of the bodies that made legislation. And as I say, it completely excluded the majority of the black population. And so then this kind of referendum is endorsed in which only white people are allowed to vote. And so in response to this, the black working class don't just say, okay, fine, we'll go along with this. There's an immediate 2-day general strike that took place, which kind of brought the whole of the country to a standstill. And they did it just as Parliament was opened. This gives a flavour of, especially now in the early 80s into the mid 80s, the revolutionary movement that was developing. This is the most important thing. In 1985, then, you have the other kind of most significant part, if you want, of this revolutionary movement and the struggle against apartheid, where you had the powerful trade union confederation that is established, the Trade Union Confederation of the Black Working Class, which is founded. And this is an amazing event. And actually the founding Congress really expressed this revolutionary energy that was present in the movement. The Trade Union Congress, they adopted the Freedom Charter as its program, but the Congress itself was extremely radical, and you had delegates there that were actually even calling for socialism as a part of this process and the energy that was being created. By 1985, the country was in the middle of an open revolutionary crisis, because all these, I've not listed all the events, because so much was taking place and so much backlash, and the state is scrambling around trying to work out what to do. You could say the most sensible or forward-thinking aspects of the ruling class had started to sense where this is going to go and started to realize we're probably going to have to give up a bit of stuff or we will lose everything, as in terms of capitalism. And they were starting to think about this. And we should also say the ANC had also started to think about this. And in terms of negotiations and the negotiations that would eventually end apartheid, the ANC did have secret meetings with the apartheid regime in different ways to begin to discuss what could a transition look like. So from that point, they were betraying, right, in terms of this revolutionary movement that was developing and the energy and the willingness of sacrifice that people had. But they had already begun to have these meetings and thinking about negotiation. But as I say, in 1985, there's this open revolutionary crisis. The apartheid state's trying to put these reforms forward, but it's not really able to do so. Uprisings are taking place. There are so many state of emergencies that are declared all the time in this period. Virtual martial law was declared, but all of this only fueled the fire even further. The revolutionary movement was actually creating its own structures. Like, the apartheid state was there, but people just did whatever they wanted. They would chase out the official state. There were like embryonic forms of alternative power, street committees, area committees, self-defense committees. This would spring up all over the country. By the end of 1985, only a handful of more than 100 local authorities the government had set up were still in existence. This was what the ruling class were absolutely terrified of. The government was unable to maintain control of the townships, despite the state of emergencies and all of this kind of stuff. They would just basically expand the state of emergencies. It'd be in one district, and then they'd be like, we need to make it bigger. We need to make it go even further. Every day there were reports of more state repression and mass atrocities, because they were panicking. They were trying to go harder in terms of the repression that they were putting out. But that repression and the killings that they would do just pushed the movement on. So anywhere that there was a mass atrocity, what would follow that were huge funerals where tens of thousands of people would show up. And obviously these weren't just tens of thousands of people just stood there mourning. These were political rallies that would push people further on to the next thing. In one area, 50,000 people turned up to the funeral of 4 students who had been killed by the police. In another area, it was estimated a crowd of 70,000 people showed up. And the police would constantly try and put restrictions on the amount of people who were allowed to show, but none of this would happen. And so there were these constant battles between what was now the forces of revolution and counter-revolution that would go on and on and on. I have endless examples, but I'm running out of time, so I'll try and sum up. The point is, in this moment of revolutionary fever and crisis, obviously the regime is thinking maybe we can grant a few reforms here and there. But precisely when a regime, like a kind of, if you want to call it a dictatorship regime or whatever it is, precisely the moment that they try to grant reforms is the most dangerous moment for a regime and for any kind of system. And they were really at risk of being completely overthrown. They actually considered releasing Mandela earlier than when they actually did. Mandela was released in 1990, but in 1985 they were thinking maybe we need to just release him now. Why? On the condition that he would stop what was taking place, that he would hold the whole of the movement back. But in the end, they decide to wait a little bit. There were arguments within the apartheid state and within the government over what's the best way to take this forward. But eventually they took the sensible route from the point of view of maintaining capitalism. In 1986, in May Day, saw the biggest general strike in the country's history. And it was repeated a few weeks later to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Soweto uprisings and so on and so forth. All of this happened. Effectively, the movement itself unbanned the ANC, despite what the government had implemented at all. And so at the local level, the apartheid state had virtually collapsed and the movement was very, very there. So as I say, the same ruling class that for years had kept Mandela in prison, from now on, they could see there's no other way that we can do this. They kind of change tack and think, right, now we need to use Mandela to stop this from going any further. Now, I'm going to try and sum up. The point is, in all of this, and this lays the basis for Mandela being released, the ANC then entering into these negotiations, and then new elections that eventually take place in which the ANC won. In all of this, I have not mentioned BDS. And the reason for that is because we are told that BDS and the international community played this massive, almost defining role in the struggle against apartheid. And I think that's wrong. I think that's the wrong way to frame it. When you study and you look at the events that took place, it's very, very clear that it was the black working class themselves and the power of themselves collectively organized that eventually ended apartheid. But our argument is they could have gone even further. They could have gone even further. And look, this thing about sanctions and all this kind of stuff, it wasn't until 1986 that economic sanctions were declared. And obviously this had nothing to do with human rights concerns or anything like this. It was actually then, because they could see the role that the working class was playing, that it could fight capitalism itself. They were trying to also temper the movement, say, okay, let's change this, and then having to convince the South African government, the apartheid state, that maybe you need to change tack here because this is going to grow into something much bigger. In fact, from 1985 to 1989, export volumes rose in South Africa by 26%, and they had sanctions on every single level, also culturally in sports and education and all of this kind of stuff. But that isn't what significantly undermined the regime. It was the action of the workers themselves. Nonetheless, all of this is what produced the pressure and the negotiations that eventually took place. And I want to make one more point about Mandela, which is that in 1993, a really significant thing happened, which was Chris Hani, who was a very popular leading member of the Communist Party. He was assassinated by an anti-communist, it was an anti-communist guy, with the help of a far-right nationalist. And this caused absolute uproar. He was a very popular leader. And for more than 10 days, there was this kind of mass movement, again, general strike, all of this uproar at his assassination. And it was precisely at this moment as an example of how Nelson Mandela used all of his role and authority and leadership in the struggle to hold things back. Because it created so much anger, it was quite volatile, and the ruling class were very scared of where this anger was going to go. And so Nelson Mandela appeared on television and literally appealed for calm. And he said, Tonight, I am reaching out to every single South African, black and white, from the very depths of my being. A white man full of prejudice and hate came to our country and committed a deed so foul. But he says, now is the time for all South Africans to stand together against those who, from any quarter, wish to destroy what Chris Hani gave his life for, the freedom of all of us. This is Nelson Mandela using all of his immense authority to hold back the movement and restart negotiations with the regime. And he had immense authority, of course he did. He was in prison for 27 years, right? This created a massive mood there. But he used all of it to ease a transition within the framework of capitalism. Imagine instead there was a leadership in place that used all of its authority to lead a struggle against capitalism, of which the masses were ready and willing to partake in. But that is not what happened, and that is why we have the South Africa that we do today. It's a legacy of the ANC, and it's a bit of the legacy of Mandela himself, that they did not confront capitalism. And in fact, in all the negotiations that they had, they did not touch the question of capital, of the economic basis of society, of land ownership, which still completely blights the majority of black workers in South Africa today. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. And how much did the black workers give? What more could they have done? Strike after strike, protest after protest, struggle after struggle. But what was absent and what was missing was a leadership that would take them the whole and full way. When you think of all of that struggle, all of those strikes, all of those demonstrations by hundreds of thousands of people again and again, it proves to us and shows us the enduring nature of the class struggle, that it was the class struggle, the collective power of the working class that stopped apartheid in the first place, but also that it will be, and it must be, the class struggle and the collective power of the working class that destroys capitalism in South Africa, which continues to produce untold misery and depression and poverty and racism and segregation every single day. So we should be totally inspired by the struggle against apartheid, but at the same time frustrated at the way in which it was beheaded by its true purpose. So when you think about apartheid, think about struggle, think about class struggle, and think about the need to commit yourselves to a conscious revolutionary leadership which will complete a struggle in its completion to actually undo the basis upon which racism, segregation, and horrors are based. Thank you.